Welcome back to another episode of Spanish with Profe Nader. Tonight we have an exciting matchup. It's a fight, actually. It is the preterite tense versus the imperfect tense. That's right. But who's going to win?
Why can't we be friends? Why can't we be friends?
Well, why do they have to fight at all? Can't they just be friends and get along? Or is this just more madness? Is this the madness like por versus para and ser versus estar? Yes, it is. More madness coming your way. Because in Spanish we have two ways to describe the past. English only has one tense to describe the past. Now you might think, well, this truly is madness. But many of the Romantic languages like French, Italian, Portuguese have two tenses for the past. So, how does your gringo brain understand how to use which tense? Well, if you've always wondered which tense to use, you've tuned into the right video. As I said previously, Spanish has two tenses to describe the past, where English only has one. A good way to learn these tenses is to contrast them with each other. Let's look at this slide that depicts time. If we think of time as linear, we can think of four ways to conceptualize the past. We can think of a beginning of an action, we can think of the end of an action, or we can view a completed action as a unit. For example, let's say I have an English sentence where I say, I had a great time last summer. So summer may have lasted 2 or 3 months, but it's now over and I'm viewing that action as one completed action. In the middle, we have the repetition of an action in the past, something that kind of keeps on going without a beginning or an end, and is something that we consider a habitual action. This is useful because that repetition of an action in the past or an ongoing action without a beginning and an end is actually where we use the imperfect tense. So let's continue with some more slides. A good way to begin is by learning the triggers. When I teach students the difference between the preterite and the imperfect, I emphasize something called triggers. A trigger is a key word in a sentence that indicates when to use one or the other of the two tenses, and it can be very useful. A trigger for the Spanish preterite tense might be something like ayer, yesterday, anoche, last night, la semana pasada, esta mañana, esta tarde. These triggers frame the action and help you to decide, okay, well, this action is really where I use the preterite tense. If we contrast that with triggers for the Spanish imperfect tense, we have something that's a little more ongoing, and it happens consistently, todos los días, típicamente, muchas veces, siempre, y mientras. Okay, well, let's begin with the preterite tense. When do I use the preterite tense? If you were to ask a Spanish person, a native speaker, and ask that person, when do I use the preterite or the imperfect? First of all, they might not even know what the preterite and imperfect are. They just use the language because that's how they've learned how to use it. And if you ask them to help you with between the preterite and the imperfect, they might just say, well, one sounds right and one sounds wrong. And so that's not really very useful for you as an English speaker. What is useful is to come up with a phrase. And I teach my students a simple phrase called SS Ben. Now SS Ben doesn't really mean anything. It's just a memory device to help you understand which tense to use. So let's begin. Okay, what does SS Ben mean? Well, nothing by itself. It just contains some of the hints that will help you remember when to use the preterite tense. So let's go over each one of these individually. First of all, the first S, or rule number 1. Use the preterite tense when you're talking about a single action completed in the past. For example, I studied my homework. When? Yesterday. Estudié mi tarea ayer. This would be a preterite action. The second S, a series of actions in the past. It's very similar to the first S, only now you are describing a series of actions. For example, this morning I got up, I showered, and I ate breakfast. Esta mañana me levanté, me duché y desayuné. So these are a series of actions, but still they're completed in the past. B stands for the beginning of a past action, like I started an interesting book. Empecé un libro interesante. Number 4 is a completed event, or the E in SS-Ben. I filled the bottle with water. Llené la botella con agua. Now, it's important to understand that these things, SS-Ben just gives you some clues as to when or not to use the preterite tense. You don't need to definitely take one of these rules and start saying, well, it doesn't agree with another rule because you're overthinking it. It's just a set of guidelines to help you understand when to use the preterite tense. The N in SS-Ben is an interrupted narrative, and this requires a little explanation because it's where we introduce the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense is used for events that are incomplete or continuing with no reference to time. I'll talk more about the imperfect tense in part 2 of this video. For example, though, I was eating when some other action happened. So it's an action you're describing in the imperfect tense, something that you were doing, you were eating, when another action interrupted that imperfect action. And that action that interrupts the imperfect action is the preterite tense. So we actually use the preterite tense for interrupting a narrative. And for example, in this next slide, I was eating when she entered the room. So here's an example where we have the imperfect tense and the preterite tense actually in the same sentence. I was eating, that's an action that's imperfect, it's ongoing, when suddenly another action interrupted that narrative. She entered into the room. That action, or that verb that we would conjugate, would be in the preterite tense, while I was eating would be in the imperfect tense. As I said, it's common to have both tenses in the same sentence, so let's look at some other examples. I was studying when she called me. Yo estaba estudiando cuando ella me llamó. So this would be an example of I was studying, doing something, when another action interrupted that, the fact that she called. I was going to go to the mall, but I couldn't. Iba a ir al centro, pero no pude. The best way to learn is to practice. Let's practice a couple of just sentences. These are all in the preterite. We moved to Colorado 10 years ago. Nos mudamos a Colorado hace 10 años. Because you're indicating a time frame of when this action happened, that would be in the preterite. What did you do yesterday? Again, there's a trigger question, a trigger word, yesterday, that lets us frame that this sentence is we would use the preterite. For more practice using the preterite tense, go to my YouTube channel and subscribe, and you can download a grammar packet that I've created that has the rules to the preterite tense and also has some exercises that you can do. And make sure you tune in to part 2 of the preterite and the imperfect, where I'll be doing the imperfect tense. Hasta luego.
Dale nomás, dale que va, que allá en el horno nos vamos a encontrar. No pienses más.